You're in the dark. Literally, the power grid died 3 days ago. Your phone's at 2%. And the only light you see comes from the cracked screen in your hand. That digital window to a world that doesn't exist anymore. And you think, well, at least I still have internet. You don't. What you have is about 18 minutes before your last contact with civilization turns into a useless brick of glass and aluminum. 18 minutes to figure out where the hell your family is. 18 minutes before you realize you should have paid attention to that stupid video about manual generators instead of watching compilations of cats falling. But relax. I'm going to teach you how to build an emergency hand crank charger using scrap high school physics you pretended to understand and a concerning amount of electrical tape. Will it work? Probably. Will you die trying? Depends on how seriously you take my instructions about not licking the copper terminals. And there's something else, something about the real reason why commercial generators were never designed to last that I'll only tell you at the end. Spoiler, it's not an accident. So hit that damn like button now, because if you wait until the battery dies, you'll forget. And subscribe to the channel not for the content, but because when civilization actually collapses, you'll need to know where to find me to trade knowledge for canned food. Oh, and since we were talking about electrical apocalypse, I made a complete video teaching how to survive a total blackout, water, food, security, everything. If you want to really be prepared when the lights go out and don't come back. The link is in the first pinned comment, because building a charger is cool, but knowing what to do when shit hits the fan, that's essential. Ready? Great, let's build something that the apocalyptic version of you will thank, or hate, probably. Hate. The physics of your own irrelevant. Step 1. Understand what you're creating. Before creating a bomb you think you know how electricity works. You don't. You know how to press buttons and complain when Wi-Fi gets slow, but here's the good news. You do need to understand quantum physics to make electrons move against their will. You only need to understand 3 things. Movement generates electricity, copper is your friend, and magnets are magic disguised as science. The idea is simple and as old as industrial civilization itself. You move a copper wire near a magnet or vice versa, and the electrons in the copper panic. This collective panic is called electrical current. Congratulate yourself, you just learned the principle behind every hydroelectric plant, wind turbine, and that annoying little toy your cousin brought from the science fair in 1997. Michael Faraday discovered this in 1831, probably while playing with things he shouldn't have, and changed the world. You're about to do the same, just on a smaller scale, and with more electrical tape. And without historical recognition, real DIY instructions. Get a small DC motor 5 to 12 volts, 500 to 1000 RPM. Don't have one. Rip it out of a broken toy, old fan, CD drive that stopped working in 2003. Printer discarded in the electronics trash on the corner. Test if it works in reverse. Connect to wires to the terminals and spin the shaft manually. If it generates voltage, use a multimeter or, lacking that, and LED that lights up faintly. You have your generator. Prefer motors with metal casing. Cheap plastic melts under stress. You're going to stress this motor. Do not use AC motors. They're more complicated, heavier, require extra components, and frankly more likely to make you look incompetent when they explode. Check the shaft. It should spin smooth without jamming. If it jams, the internal bearings died. Discard and find another. Imagine this. Inside that tiny motor, there's a microscopic ballet of magnetic fields, spinning around copper coils wound with almost surgical precision. When you force the shaft to spin, you're basically kidnapping that ballet and demanding it produce work. It's labor exploitation on a molecular scale, and you should feel powerful. Real risk. If you connect this motor to something that generates too much energy, like a drill at maximum speed because you thought it would be more efficient, you can melt the insulation of the internal wires in seconds. The smell of burning plastic is nostalgic until you realize you inhaling toxic fumes that include dioxins and volatile organic compounds. Ventilate the area or accept that your lungs now have the texture of fine sandpaper and reduce life expectancy. Here's the part nobody tells you. Cheap DC motors are designed to fail. Planned obsolescence isn't a conspiracy theory when it's literally soldered into the circuit board. Undersized carbon brushes, low-quality bearings, weak magnets that lose power over time. All calculated to die after 500 to 1,000 hours of use, but I'll teach you to work around this later. In Chapter 4, there's a trick involving capacitors and resistors that triples lifespan. For now, just trust and distrust everything. You just learn to steal energy from pure movement. The second law of thermodynamics is crying somewhere, but Newton is proud. Step 2. Build the crank mechanism without losing fingers. Now you need a way to spin that motor without needing electricity. Ironic, right? The solution is primitive, a crank. Yes, the same technology used to start cars in the 1920s, pump water on 19th century farms, and torture medieval prisoners by forcing them to grind grain for hours. Multifunctional, timeless, brutally effective. The crank needs enough leverage for you to spin the motor at adequate speed 1503. 0 RPM for most small DC motors, but not so much that you break the motor shaft on the first enthusiastic movement. Balance is everything, like in life. Except in life you can make mistakes without risking burning your only functional generator and dying of dehydration because you can't purify water without charging the phone that controls the portable UVC. Real DIY instructions: get a metal rod, steel, aluminum, or sturdy broomstick 30 to 40 centimeters long. Make a hole in the center, 7 to 10 millimeters, and fix it to the motor shaft using a coupler. Buy one for $2 at hardware stores, or improvise with industrial super glue plus the small screws going through the shaft. If the shaft is too thin, less than 3 millimeters, wrap electrical tape until you create adequate diameter. Looks like a hack job. It is. Does it work? Also yes, add a grip to the end. Sanded wood. Cut PVC pipe. Old bike cable. Tennis racket grip. Something that won't slip when your hands are sweaty from existential panic and calibrated hopelessness. Test the rotation. Should spin smooth, without excessive resistance. If you feel resistance, either you got the measurements wrong or the motor already died internally and you raise spinning a mechanical corpse. Add a small counterweight metal nut. Heavy washer on the opposite side of the grip to balance the rotation. This reduces vibration by 60%. Imagine a medieval watermill wheel, but powered by the brute force of your contemporary desperation and stubbornness. Each complete rotation injects a pulse of voltage into the system. Romantic. In the most dystopian sense possible, each movement is a negotiation with the universe. I work. You give me electrons. The universe rarely refuses free work. Real risk: if the crank is too long, over 50 centimeters, or you spin too fast with suicidal momentum, you can generate voltage spikes exceeding 15 volts that instantly fry your phone's charging circuit. Modern components are designed for efficiency, not resilience. A single 18-volt spike for 0.2 seconds is enough to kill the battery management chip. And then you have a permanently dead phone and a functional crank. Congratulations! You created a very expensive arm exerciser. Solution: voltage regulator, but that comes later. For now, just don't be the idiot who spins at maximum speed because it seems more efficient. Efficiency without control is chaos with statistics, and statistics don't care about your good intentions. And here's something you need to know, but will only make sense in Chapter 5, the crank position and shaft angle relative to the ground. Affect efficiency by up to 40%. It has to do with torque, angular momentum, force distribution, and other shit that mechanical engineers take so seriously. They get master's degrees in it. Store this in memory. It'll be worth it. I promise. You just reduce 5,000 years of technological evolution to spin the stick faster. Humility was never so literal. Step 3. Regulate the voltage before becoming electronic barbecue so you have a motor. You have a crank. Congratulations, you're generating electricity like a hamster in a wheel. Except the hamster has more dignity and doesn't know it's being exploited. But here's the problem. The electricity you're generating is chaotic, unstable, and completely inadequate for any device manufactured after 1987. Your phone needs exactly 5 volts plus or minus 5%. More than that, internal components start to suffer. Less than that, it won't charge. You see the dilemma. It's like trying to feed a baby with a fire hose. Technically possible, ethically questionable, practically disastrous. You need a voltage regulator. Specifically, an LM7805, the most reliable, most documented, and easiest to find chip that humanity has mass-produced since 1972. It is literally a piece of silicon that says, no matter how much shit you throw at me, I'll always give you stable 5 volts. It's the Keanu Reeves of electronic components. Reliable, immortal, universally respected, real DIY instructions. Buy $1 to 2 or recover from electronic waste an LM7805 regulator. Recognize it by the 7805 marking and 3 metal pins. Identify the pins, looking at the front of the flat side text visible. From left to right, input, ground, output. Connect the input pin to the motor's positive terminal using 22 AWG wire or similar. Connect the output pin to the red wire of the USB cable you'll use for charging. Cut an old cable. Discard the micro USB lightning end. Keep the USB. Connect the middle pin ground to both the motor's negative terminal and the USB. Black wire. Don't reverse this. Never, under any circumstances. Solder everything with 60/40 at solder tin. Lead, no solder. Use wire twisting minimum 5 complete turns plus electrical tape in thick layers minimum 3 turns. Don't be lazy. Add a 100F electrolytic capacitor or 220F if you find it at the regulator input. Polarity matters. Long leg positive goes to input. Short leg negative goes to ground. Add another identical capacitor at the output. This smooths voltage spikes and reduces electrical noise that causes heating. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention, there is a specific component you will need to add between the motor and the first capacitor if you want this to last more than a week of continuous use. It's a rectifier diode. I'll tell you exactly which one and why manufacturers hide this in Chapter 5. I promise it's worth the wait for now. Just mentally note, diode equals important. Imagine the regulator as an ultra-selective nightclub bouncer, only lets in those with exactly the right voltage, appropriately dressed, without erratic behavior. Everyone else the 12 volts peaks drunk on uncontrolled kinetic energy stays in line suffering, or gets brutally expelled through the back door. Civilized, efficient, slightly fascist. Exactly what you need between chaos and order. By the way, since we're talking about electronic components and survival, I made a complete video about how to survive a total blackout, not just phone charging, but drinking water, food preservation, security, communication, everything you need when infrastructure collapses. The link is in the first pinned comment. Because knowing how to make a charger is great, but knowing what to do in the first 72 hours without electricity, that saves lives. Real risk if you connect the LM7805 wrong reverse input, output, or worse. Connect 12 volts directly to the output pin. It will heat up to temperatures that melt solder greater than 200 Celsius. Literally, you'll smell the characteristic smell of burning silicon, half metallic, half chemical, totally horrible. Seconds later, it dies permanently, no resurrection, no repair. And you just lost the only regulator available within a 50 kilometers radius. Because all electronics stores are looted, closed, or operating as post-apocalyptic barter bases, you just domesticated electrical chaos with $8 chip and knowledge stolen from the internet. Entropy will still win in the end. But at least not today. Step 4. Assemble everything into a structure that won't collapse on first use. You have the pieces. Motor, crank, regulator, capacitors, fragmented dreams of self-sufficiency. Now you need a structure, something that holds everything together without looking like you assembled it during a psychotic episode induced by excessive caffeine and conspiracy videos on YouTube. Spoiler, it will look exactly like that. But at least it will work. Functionality trumps aesthetics when the power grid is dead. The structure needs to be rigid enough to withstand the force of the crank you're going to spin with anger. Trust me, especially on the third day without a hot shower, light enough to carry in a backpack, and modular enough for quick repairs using improvised tools. Plywood is ideal, cheap, abundant, easy to work with. Thick ABS plastic 5mm plus works if you find it. Metal is performative overkill, but if you want to look like a hardcore prepper on online forums, go ahead. Real DIY instructions. Cut a rectangular plywood base 20 by 30 centimeters, thickness 10 to 15 millimeters. Mark the center and fix the motor using 2M for screws going through the casing. If the motor doesn't have holes, make them using a drill with 4mm bit. Mount side supports 5 by 5 by 3 centimeters with blocks to stabilize the crankshaft. The crank should spin freely without touching the base. Create a side compartment small plastic box, mint tin. Cut Tupperware for the regulator and capacitors, away from motor heat, ideally 15 centimeters distance. Make a hole in the box and pass the wires connecting to the circuit. Seal with silicone or hot glue to protect against moisture. Add a female USB port by for $1 or recover from old charger. Solder the wires to the circuit respecting polarity. Red equals plus 5 volts, black equals ground. Protect everything with a removable cover, another piece of plywood. Fixed with screws or improvised hinges. You will need to open this later for maintenance. Add rubber feet cut from old flip-flop. Drawer liner rubber to the base to absorb vibration. Imagine a medieval torture machine. Redesigned by an engineer who quit corporate life, but still has PTSD from impossible deadlines. Each component is exposed, vulnerable, screaming please break me, but it's also accessible. Repairable, honest, there's no marketing here, no Apple minimalist design. Just you against the relentless laws of thermodynamics and material resistance. Now, remember what I said in Chapter 1 about capacitors and lifespan. Here's the secret. Add a 470F capacitor 16 volts or more between the motor and the first capacitor you already installed. This filters high-frequency electrical noise, that invisible chaotic oscillation that gradually wears down internal components, like water dripping on stone. Without this additional filter, your regulator dies in 1/3 of the expected time, 150 hours versus 500 hours. Manufacturers don't include this because planned maintenance is guaranteed profit. Consumers buy. The product breaks, they buy again. Perfect cycle. You're not here for profit. You're here for survival, autonomy, and a healthy middle ground between hardcore prepper and functional person in society. Real risk if the structure is weak or poorly balanced. The constant vibration from the crank will loosen connections into the 3 hours of use. Loose wires touch where they shouldn't. Inevitable short circuit, impressive sparks, smell of melted plastic. Your generator becomes an improvised $30 lighter, and let's face it, you already have too many lighters and too few generators. Invest time in the structure. Don't be lazy here. You just built the electronic equivalent of a functional Frankenstein. Except instead of causing chaos in the village, it charges your Instagram progress. Step 5. Test without exploding. Optimize without going insane. Moment of truth. You assembled this thing. It looks fragile but robust. Looks dangerous but controlled. Looks exactly like the kind of invention that future documentarians will show in retrospectives about the first signs of collapse, when ordinary people started building primitive technology at home. But does it actually work? Connect your phone. Take a deep breath. Start spinning the crank. Smooth, constant, rhythmic. Like you're convincing a wild animal not to attack you, or calming a crying child at 3 a.m. Watch the phone screen. If the small charging icon appears, lightning bolt inside the battery, you won the first battle. If nothing appears, either you got something fundamental wrong, or your phone already died from accumulated digital desperation and planned obsolescence. Real DIY instructions. Test without load. First, disconnect the USB and use a multimeter on the output terminals. Spin the crank at moderate speed. Should consistently read 5 volts plus or minus 0.3 volts tolerable. If it reads less than 4.5 volts, you're spinning too slowly or the regulator is poorly connected. If it reads more than 5.5 volts, the regulator died or you didn't install the capacitors correctly. Connect the phone with partially discharged battery. 20 to 60% ideal for testing. Spin at moderate speed to 3 complete rotations per second. Check the charging indicator. If it's charging slowly 1% every 3 to 5 minutes, it's working perfectly. If it's the fast 1% per minute, be suspicious. Could be unregulated voltage spike. That will fry the phone. Adjust crank speed experimentally. To fast equals motor and regulator overheating. To slow equals insufficient charge, wasted mechanical energy. Monitor regulator temperature by touching with finger carefully. If it burns instantly, add a heat sink. Improvise by gluing thermal paste plus super glue copper or aluminum coins to the chip's metal surface. Measure time. 100 rotations should add approximately 1 to 2% charge to a modern smartphone. 3000 milliamp hours. This means 5,000 to 10,000 rotations for full charge. Your arm will agree that electrical apocalypse is physically exhausting. Imagine rowing against the tide of universal entropy, 1 crank rotation at a time, sweating physically and existentially. Each movement is a silent but violent declaration. I refuse to be obsolete. I refuse to depend on infrastructure that can fail. I choose autonomy. The machine purrs mechanically. The phone breathes electronically. You're alive, functional, prepared. Now, about that crank position and motor angle I mentioned before, the ideal is to keep the motor shaft at a perpendicular angle to the ground, 90, with the crank spinning in a horizontal plane. Any motor tilt greater than 15 wastes up to 40% of energy in poorly distributed friction in the bearings and misaligned torque. That's why commercial generators always fix motors horizontally with almost obsessive precision. Adjust your structure now. Measure with a level or phone app. Ironic, I know. And thank yourself later when you don't need to spin 15,000 times. And about that rectifier diode I promised to explain, add a 1N for 007 diode, 20 cents. Any store on the positive wire between the motor and the first capacitor. The marking silver ring should point to the capacitor, not to the motor. This prevents current from flowing back to the motor when you stop spinning, avoiding loss of already generated charge. Increases efficiency by 15 to 20%. Manufacturers omit this because extra components equals extra costs equals lower margins. You just added it for less than a quarter. And here's the truth I promised in the opening: commercial hand crank generators, those sold for $50 to $100 on camping and prepper sites, use intentionally weak components. Not because they're cheap, although they are, but because the entire industry operates under a calculated obsolescence model. Their regulator overheats because it doesn't have adequate heat sink. The capacitors are undersized 10F when it should be 100F. The crank wears the shaft because there's no factory lubrication. The solders are cold and weak. Everything planned to fail after 300 to 500 hours of use, forcing repurchase. Yours, with minimal maintenance, clean quarterly, relubricate annually. Replace capacitors every 2 years, easily lasts a decade. You just built the immortal version, or at least significantly longer lived, of something designed to die, and this knowledge is worth more than the entire equipment. Subscribe to the channel now because you just learned the industrial secret. That's literally worth hundreds of dollars in avoided repurchases. And if you think I'm exaggerating, wait for the next video. I'm going to teach you to resurrect lead-acid batteries considered dead. It'll be technically fascinating and legally questionable in 3 states. Real risk if you test this in an enclosed environment. Without adequate ventilation for more than 30 minutes, the accumulated heat, motor plus regulator, plus your body spinning the crank, can damage sensitive electronic components and also dangerously dehydrate you. Test outdoors, near an open window or with a fan. And if a neighbor asks what you rate doing spinning a crank connected to wires, while muttering mathematical calculations alone, simply answer with a smile, preparation, they'll leave you alone. Or call the appropriate authorities. 50-50 it's probability, both leave you alone eventually. You just proved you can literally steal energy from the universe, using nothing but mechanical movement. Applied stubbornness and sarcasm as an emotional defense mechanism. Step 6. Keep alive what you created because nothing else will last. Congratulations. You have a functional, tested, optimized hand crank generator. This puts you, statistically speaking, in the absolute top 0.01% of the population in terms of technical preparation for prolonged energy collapse. The other 99.99%. They'll be violently fighting over old AA batteries at looted gas stations while you, majestically, spin your artisanal crank illuminated by the cold and comforting light of 5 stable volts. But here's the part nobody romanticizes in post-apocalyptic movies full of cinematic filters and protagonists with perfectly white teeth. Continuous maintenance is real survival. That iconic scene where the hero has equipment working perfectly after 6 months abandoned in a humid bunker. Absolute lie. Everything oxidizes. Everything wears down. Everything betrays you eventually, including and especially technology. Real DIY maintenance. Instructions: every 50 cumulative hours of use, clean the motor's internal contacts with 99% isopropyl alcohol and cotton swab. Microscopic conductive dust accumulates and causes invisible shorts that drain efficiency. Monthly or every 20 hours, apply light lithium grease to the crankshaft and joints. Without adequate lubrication, friction increases exponentially, up to 300% in 6 months of regular use. Quarterly, check all solders with magnifying glass. Constant microscopic vibration gradually weakens them, creating invisible microfractures. Resolder preventively where it looks suspicious. Biennially, test electrical resistance of all connections with multimeter. Should be less than 0.5 ohms. More than that indicates oxidation or cold solder. Annually, replace ALL electrolytic capacitors. Preventively, they degrade internally with heat and time even without use. Dying capacitors equals vulnerable regulator equals eventually fried phone. Always, store in dry location, relative humidity less than 60%. Inside plastic bag with silica gel packets. Moisture is literally metastatic cancer for electronic circuits. Imagine your generator as an electronic pet that requires minimal neglect, but regular attention to not abandon you at the worst possible moment. You don't need to love it emotionally, but you need to respect it functionally, like you respect a sharp knife, for what it can do for you and potentially to you if treated with disrespect. Ignored existential risk. The real danger isn't the generator failing catastrophically, although it can. It's you blindly trusting it will work when you really need it after months stored away. Test monthly religiously. Spin the crank 50 times. Charge something small, lead, power bank. Don't wait to discover that the regulator oxidized and died silently. Precisely when the battery is at 1% and you desperately need to call for help or access offline maps, or confirm your family is alive. Here is something profound nobody tells you about homemade DIY technology. The physical act of building something with your hands changes you neurologically. More than the object built. You now look at old electric motors and see hidden energy potential. At refrigerator magnets and see imprisoned magnetic power. Add copper wires and see civilization condensed in metal. UV developed a practical technical literacy that 99% of the population has irreversibly lost in the last 2 generations of passive consumerism. And that, honestly, is more valuable than any 20,000 milliamp hours portable battery sold on Amazon with Prime delivery. Closing. So, you made it here. Read 3,500 words about how to build a hand crank generator. Learned about voltage, current, regulation, capacitance, planned obsolescence, and the sad universal truth that the tech industry sees you primarily as a biological ATM with constant and artificially created needs. You have, literally in your grease-stained hands, a device capable of transforming human movement into tangible digital hope. But let us be brutally honest for a moment. The chance you'll actually use this in a real and prolonged electrical apocalypse, statistically low. The chance you'll simply store it in a drawer or garage and forget about it until the video goes viral and you want to show skeptical friends at a barbecue, statistically high. And you know what? That's perfectly fine, because the deep real victory wasn't building the physical generator. It was proving empirically to yourself that you can. It was understanding viscerally that technology is incomprehensible magic. It is just bad-tempered physics you can manipulate with adequate knowledge. It was realizing philosophically that total dependence is a systemic choice, and you just consciously chose the opposite. And about those narrative open loops I strategically opened throughout the script, all meticulously closed, the secret capacitor, revealed and justified, the critical crank position, explained with numbers, the emitted rectifier diode, exposed and implemented, the industrial conspiracy of planned obsolescence, documented and circumvented. You literally have all necessary information. Now it's exclusively about execution, or not, but if the world really ends, and statistically, eventually some version of this will happen, and the last functional battery charge on planet Earth is trembling in your desperate hands, you'll remember this video. You'll frantically search for the listed materials. You'll assemble with trembling fingers and an adequate candlelight illumination. You'll spin that artisanal crank like your life literally depends on it, because it will. And unlike 99.99% of the population, you'll be technically prepared. By the way, last thing, I made a super complete video teaching how to survive a total blackout. Not just energy, but drinking water, food preservation, residential security, emergency communication, first aid. Everything you really need to know in the first critical 72 hours. If you want to really be prepared when infrastructure collapses and doesn't come back, the link is in the first pinned comment. Because building a hand crank charger is impressive, but having a complete survival plan, that's essential and potentially life-saving. Last sentence. Spin. Survive. Repeat indefinitely until civilization rebuilds or you die trying.